So today we're talking about what is personal information. What we're going to do is we're going to break this into three sections. The first section we're going to look at what does personal information mean in New Zealand? And then we're going to compare it to some other countries, and we're going to touch on, well, how do we actually think about it in comparison? Certainly if your company is a global company or it has offshore aspects to it, this will be quite a key section for you to think about. And then finally, in the third section, which will be probably the later half of this session, we're going to put it into practice and to look at some areas where actually these confines of what's personal information really become quite practical. So we're going to look at home sensors and CCTV and smart homes. Look at some of these matters that are really coming out to play when we start thinking about personal information and really having a real effect on how you set up your business. Basically, what we're aiming to do today is to get two things out of it, is that you've got quite a clear, concrete understanding of what personal information is, but also we're going to look at some of those grey areas and play with them and really think about where some complexity lies. From that, hopefully, you'll be able to apply them in your business, but also acknowledge where those areas are where you might want to think about it more. So today we're going to be talking about something that's quite definitional and quite structured, but I'd like to start with something that is really more thinking about our own personal information, really to lay the foundation of what we're talking about. So I'd like to start with a wee exercise. Usually we do this session in person, so it's the first time I've done it online, but I think it will work just as well. So I'm going to ask you to be thinking about your own personal information. Don't think of anything that's too sensitive or triggering. Stay safe for what you're comfortable to think about. And you're not going to have to share it with anyone else. So just think about something that is comfortable for you to think about and nothing further. So what I'd like you to do is to think of a fact about yourself, something that's personal, something that is maybe something no one else knows, might be something a few people know. And I'd like you just to think about that fact and how it makes you feel. A lot of people, when they think about that fact, will feel a sense of connection. They'll also feel maybe some emotions that go alongside that information about yourself. Now, what I want you to do is to imagine you take that fact and you write it down on a piece of paper. Now, again, how does that sense of connection make you feel with that piece of paper? Now, what many people feel is some form of connection to that information. Now, imagine that you take that piece of paper. If we're in a session, I might even ask you to do this. As you take that piece of paper and you give it to me, I promise I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to look at it. It's just going to go into a box. And again, just imagine that scenario and think about it. And again, think of that connection. And as we go through today's session and we talk about the definitions of personal information, just keep coming back to that feeling that you have to that piece of paper. It may be that that is something for you personally you're not too concerned about. It might be something that you feel a very real, tangible sense to it. But when we're talking about databases and facts about ourselves, that feeling is quite key to what we're talking about. So we're going to move to the definitional phase, but keep coming back to that as we go through it. If you attended the session a couple of weeks ago, this slide was one that we went through. That in New Zealand, personal information is information about an identifiable individual. We have this definition, it's provided by the Privacy Act, And it's quite useful. It's useful because each word in it is quite key. If you didn't attend that session 2 weeks ago, it doesn't matter because we're going to work through it again in a bit more detail. But again, it touches back on that exercise that we're thinking about information about ourselves. And that word about is key in New Zealand. And there's more than enough discussion about this. We've had 26 years of this definition being applied to know that about matters. In New Zealand, what we take that to mean is that information is about a person when it touches on a person's rights and responsibility. Now, that kind of means, is it going to affect a person? If someone gains something or loses something due to this personal information, then that's kind of a good indicator that it's information about that person. This is the most challenging around administrative data because, well, just because information is in someone's file or has some connection to them doesn't mean that it meets this characteristic of being about them. So when we look at what is personal information, that can get a bit difficult because there might be a whole range of information that's in someone's file that actually really doesn't touch on them very much. It might show when staff members are on duty and when they're off duty. It might touch on policies and procedure, but it might not actually affect them too much. For anyone that really wants to dig into this, there's a book I'd actually suggest, which is, there's a book by an author called Christina Ng-Nippert called Islands of Privacy, where she actually looked at this from quite a quantitative perspective. And how she did this was got people to try and assess what they considered most private and most personal to them, and what they considered least personal. And the way she did this was quite creative, which was to take the contents of people's bags. Now, one thing that was quite interesting and touches on this privacy interest that we're talking about today is that she took 500 people and no one person in this study actually came out with the exact same list. So this shows this characteristic to what we're talking about, that it is personal to people, and it's really quite key that we think about the aspect of privacy from a perspective of people's subjective feelings about it. The book is Islands of Privacy for the people that missed it. I can send out the details for anyone that would like to look it up. It's by Christina Ng-Nippert, spelled E-N-G, Nippert, N-I-P-P-E-R-T. But the study looks at this and is quite an approachable book. It's quite long, but boils down to two key points, which is people really thought information was about them and it was most personal to them when it touched on two things. So the first thing was, is this going to harm a person? Intuitively, we kind of get that. Credit card details, quite clearly, if I were to tell you my card details now, I'm going to suffer something. But the second characteristic that really came out in this was that information really was about or touched on that personal core if it was something quite biographic. It was quite close to us. And thank you to who shared that. That characteristic is those things that we feel that are close to describing who we are as people. As we move along the definition, this next word is also key. It has to be an identifiable individual. Now, a lot of people get caught in this of reading in that identifiable means identified. It doesn't. So it doesn't mean that you need to have a person's name or unique identifier, their code, attached to that piece of personal information for it to be personal information. So long as you can take something else and you hold that something else and you can work out who it is, then that is personal information. Now, I said that we're going to try and meet two different objectives today. One is to provide you a concrete answer, and one is to get into those grey areas. And I want to touch on one of those grey areas here, but not dwell on it. If someone wants to touch back on it in the question time, we can come back to it. But there's a bit of a quirk in New Zealand, which is that consistently, if information is intended to identify someone, then that is personal information. And it has been consistently considered to be personal information, even if you can't actually identify the person. Now, this is actually quite difficult to get our heads around because how? But it makes sense. Motivation is key. If you're going out of your way to collect personal information to identify someone, consistently that is considered personal information. And the reason I raise this is for CCTV cameras, which we're going to get back to. It may be that the picture is grainy and that you really can't work out who it is. Indeed, the whole reason you've collected that information is trying to work out who that is because you don't know. But consistently, that's personal information. And a few times people have tried to say, but I can't identify the person. I couldn't identify the person, and therefore it is not personal information. And consistently, that hasn't succeeded. Now, the next word that really is quite operational in this sentence is person. In New Zealand, that means living, not dead, with a whole lot of exceptions. The exceptions mostly apply to births, deaths, and marriages information. But just simply because information isn't personal information doesn't mean you can release it. So if you're on that boundary, then be careful. Now, the key one I mentioned there is death information. Simply because someone is dead doesn't mean that certainly that health information or the birth deaths information coming out of government sources isn't personal. The second reason that I say really to be careful with this is a bit of a controversial point, which is that privacy in New Zealand has come out of a very Anglo-English tradition of what is private and what is personal and what we want to protect. And within certainly English tradition, there is a tradition that all of those rights of reputation and privacy extinguish when a person dies. There is a history in New Zealand around news stories as soon as someone dies to release the true story that media weren't comfortable to say when a person was alive. And the whole reason for that was this idea that when someone dies, all of their individual rights are gone relating to their reputation and privacy. The reason that this is slightly controversial in New Zealand, or indeed quite controversial in New Zealand, is that this conflicts with the tikanga and certainly the Te Ao Māori conceptions around mana and tapu. In New Zealand, our Privacy Act was drafted from a perspective that didn't really take these principles and embed them into it. So certainly from a Treaty of Waitangi perspective, you really need to do better, and you need to think about more than simply those core rights and Anglo-English conceptions of privacy, of them extinguishing on death. Because certainly within Te Ao Māori, and again within the conceptions of people and their mana continuing beyond death, you can end up in quite difficult realms very, very quickly if you take that very legalese approach of someone's information no longer being private once they die. And I said I'd get back to questions at the end, but I will actually touch on this one because it ties into this. That often that health information around hereditary information and the the the, the medical information is the most controversial area in that. So within the health code, you've got additional obligations. And they're a bit too far for us to touch on today. But I really want to just emphasize that this is a grey area that we really need to be careful when we're thinking about personal information. Indeed, actually, maybe the health code's somewhere that we should come back to in a later session. The final factor that I want to touch on here is in New Zealand, we've kind of got to this point, or indeed we have got to this point, that a person is a natural person. That just means that they're not a company. Corporate information is not personal information in New Zealand. Now this gets awfully difficult. This most frequently comes up within sole traders and limited liability companies where there's really only one director and the director's trading through it in a way that's actually quite consistent with their personal domestic affairs. And I raise this not because I can provide you a clear answer, but so that I can say, hey, actually, there's a bit of a grey area here. There's also a real consensus, I guess, that's growing at the moment that this is actually normal. And it's not. 20 years ago, this was actually up for discussion in a way that no one was really quite certain whether companies had privacy rights or not. 10 years ago, it was kind of up for discussion. And it might be that it's up for discussion again quite soon. So why do I raise that? I raise that because actually, from your perspective as people who are on this webinar trying to think about what personal information is and how to actually do this in your business, it's actually easier a lot of the time if you actually just think of all this information fitting within one box. And certainly if you're wanting to run an easy compliance program or an easy company structure, where you're structuring a program around protecting your personal information and only disclosing it where it's appropriate, actually you could do a lot worse than thinking company information is personal information anyway. If you hold it at that higher level, you're going to avoid some issues. But when it really comes to the crunch, when you really need to think about an access request or think about a particular piece of disclosure and really think about it in a detailed way, then it's worth digging into it and saying, well, is this about a person or is it about a company? If it's about a company, then the information privacy principles don't apply. You might have obligations of confidentiality to that company. You might have an agreement in place with that company, meaning that you're going to have to protect it. But you really might be able to do a lot more with that information. And the particular area I'm thinking is around business intelligence data and data analytics, because you might be able to do a lot more if it's that company data. Now, finally, I'm actually going to take a couple of steps back to an earlier word, which is about. And the final note I'd really make on this is personal information traps people from time to time because they think, well, this is personal information about X, about Kent, about Carolyn, about Mark. So it's not information about a company, or it's not information about someone else. And that's not the way it works. The way it works is that personal information can be about multiple people. So what does that mean if a file, say, is requested? Well, simply because personal information is information about a person doesn't mean that we can't not release it to another person. So it might be that simply the fact it's information about a person means they're entitled to it, even though someone else is also affected. So that's where that word about really gets into murky territory. And we really do need to be careful not to come up with this simple gut feel of saying, oh, this is information about someone else, so I can't disclose it again to, say, myself or to Carolyn, or because this information may be about multiple people. So this brings us on to the second topic for today. And this is one we won't dwell on so far, because really we could get into a very long discussion where we try and map out personal information across the globe. But it's worth really considering the fact that New Zealand's unique. We're unique in that we have this definition. And not everyone has the same definition as us. So what I'm going to do today is suggest to you that we can kind of lay it out roughly onto two axes. One axis is a larger scope. So in New Zealand, we've got quite a broad scope of what personal information covers. It's not limited by particular sets of information. So law enforcement isn't carved out. Employment data isn't carved out. It doesn't focus on particular sections or particular businesses. It also covers more people, because there's no carve-outs for classes of people that we say that personal information isn't about. But simply because New Zealand's here doesn't mean that everyone else is here, and there's no overall consensus about what personal information is. One that frequently comes up, and indeed has been quite a topic of discussion lately, is the GDPR. Now, if New Zealand's up in this top right corner, the GDPR kind of sits a bit broader. It's not necessarily precisely more broad. It's not precisely covering more people. And the reason for that is there are a couple of areas where it can potentially carve out information, in particular for law enforcement by appropriate authorities and around filing systems, and there's some uncertainty about that at the moment. But there are some areas where it is potentially a broader concept. And the reason that it's a broader concept and it's worth considering if you potentially come within the scope of the GDPR is around this idea of identifiable. In New Zealand, you hold identifiable information if you can take another one of the data sets you hold or more information you hold, and you could link that back to that person. Within the GDPR and within the European Union, there's this broader conception of if you could take another data set, even if you don't hold it, then that's that personal data. So that's potentially broader. With the privacy bill, and this is this legislation potentially looking to come in quite soon, there was a discussion where we wanted to discuss whether these broader conceptions of personal information and anonymity and de-identification came in, but we haven't quite gone there. So the GDPR is one that you need to be thinking about if you're potentially monitoring people in the EU or targeting services to the people and targeting services to people in the EU. The other one worth calling out just quite quickly is the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act. Now, policy. The difficulty there is that this kind of sits in this really murky area. There are some quite substantial carve-outs, both to the scope and the people involved. But there's also this almost continual discussion about how we're going to actually see this applied in the day-to-day affairs, certainly in the near future. There's fairly consistent discussion of legislative revision, and some of these carve-outs are changing quite quickly. The key carve-outs worth noting here is currently around that particular piece of regulation, not covering that publicly available information and not covering employment information. So while in New Zealand, the Privacy Act has a lot to say about how you treat your employees' personal information, when we're seeing a real debate, certainly in California, but also in this other legislation in America, around do we want the same legislation embedding in employment rights? The idea that people within the workplace have the same rights as the consumers is actually receiving quite a lot of controversial discussion in America. When we're seeing the potential for an American federal privacy regime, that's going to be one of these key points that's coming up. The final point I'd note on this discussion of different definitions is I think what we can see here is a bit of a trend. We're seeing as reform comes in, regulation is taking a turn towards this broader conception. What we're seeing is that less and less carve-outs are being used over what is personal information. And we're seeing that actually that's a lot easier for businesses. When there are these exceptions and there's carve-outs in place, that really means that you as a company and you as advisors to your companies are actually having to do a lot of work to work out whether this potential regulation applies. And as things get broader, actually a lot of that work goes away. So simply because more regulations coming in actually can mean less work for you as a business. So if that section kind of closed and that warning there to really think about where you're targeting services and where you're operating for this definition, we're going to take this look at some practical applications of what's personal information and where it actually gets into some areas where it really matters. So the first thing, again, coming back to a slide we covered a couple of weeks ago, is thinking about that breadth of where it applies. There are broad sections of personal information that touch on what we are and who we are and about us. So that covers our knowledge and beliefs, our authentication of who we are, our preferences, identity, medical, and certainly in New Zealand, there's very strong norms around medical information and keeping that private and personal. Ethnicity, sexuality, behavioural and physical. Financial, and again, that's actually one that's really personal to us. And it's also really culturally defined. Different cultures have very, very different views around discussing financial information, but that covers a broad range, including ownership and credit and transactional information, professional and criminal information, social networking, family and public life engagement. An area that really is booming, and an area that actually we can all reflect on today, being in a digital environment with this Zoom session, is actually we're gaining a whole lot more personal information as part of this communication and digitization of how we engage with one another. Today's session is online, and the actual amount of communication information that we're capturing is huge. One thing I'm happy to send around is a graph of personal data and the amount that's being stored year on year. And the interesting thing about that is that currently that is sitting pretty consistently as an exponential curve. Now, what that means is that it's doubling about every 18 months. For those that have dealt with Moore's law before, there was suggestion that it had broken. Well, actually, it hasn't, because it's caught back up again. So that means every 18 months, we've got this situation where the total amount is doubling. And that for us is getting into some really interesting areas where we'll discuss. I guess the crux of this is we've got this suggestion or this trend that the world is getting smarter or more digitized. When we're out and about, this is really becoming the current reality, that we have a whole lot of personal information captured about us. We've got cameras. I don't know how many people here are connected to us through Wellington, but if you're local, it's the one I know. If you walk down Lambton Quay, it's the one I'm aware of, you have a camera within 1.5 metres of you at any given time. I'm sure I could find out for Auckland. One thing that you can kind of, I guess, freak yourself out a bit is go out into public and really actually look at these cameras. As soon as you actually start looking for them, you'll notice they're everywhere. And there's these little signs saying surveillance and iconography of this surveillance that a lot of us have just kind of got used to. The other area this information is being collected is around video conferencing. And we've seen actually a lot of discussion around this in the last few weeks, and certainly as lockdown, as we've all moved into Zoom, this recognition that actually the personal information contained in these video conferences can actually be quite personal. It can be quite about us. Now, touching on this, I mean, you today are listening to me talk about privacy, but also you're able to see me. You're able to see, oh, am I feeling good or feeling bad sometimes? I can go into the meeting and my body language might be revealing a whole lot of information about how I'm feeling. We're also seeing some businesses really actually turn this into a means of, sorry, just to take a quick snapshot, someone's saying that there's sound issues around my voice. Is someone just able to confirm that whether that's everyone or just...
Okay. I can confirm it's not everyone.
Okay, good. I was worried I'd gone quiet there. Is that there is a tendency within workplaces, and we'll get to this a bit later on, is this monitoring is really being turned into a way of actually ensuring that workplaces are working effectively. So we've seen some workplaces, certainly overseas, there's been some suggesting of it occurring in New Zealand, have been asking their staff to turn on their video conferencing for the whole day so that they can log in at any time and see that their employees are working. So this new form of data collection is really something that's capturing a lot of personal information. And it's getting a lot smarter. Now, there are some means of collecting this personal information that are worth touching on, because a few years ago we were saying that there might be these smart technologies. We've actually kind of got to the point that we're there now. Now, three key ones that are worth touching on that capture a whole lot of personal information really quite quickly are these smart CCTV cameras and smart recognition technologies. For anyone that's kind of interested in them, what we're seeing is the development of technologies where they can track individual objects as the lowest tier. They can track individual people through face recognition, or they can actually track behaviours and characteristics. These technologies can be actually incredibly useful. Certainly within consumer domains, we can see businesses, for instance, track a person around a shop, and that might mean that they are able to track consumer behaviour and how people interact with signs and marketing. It might be that you want to, within your business, work out what products and services you deliver where. It might be that the centre of the store has a greater amount of throughput volume, so you might want to put your highest value items there. But this is all personal information, because when we come back to it and come back to that definition and come back to that feeling in that first session, it fits squarely within that. Now, at the end of this, we'll talk about where that actually gets into the real rubber hitting the road. But it's worth really considering, if your business is interested in capturing this information, you really need to think about those privacy considerations. The clearest example, and the one where I know it certainly caused a concern, is the concern around supermarkets. So within supermarkets, there's a real knowledge that the items at the end of the row are much higher throughput than the items in the middle of the row. If you put items down low, they're much less likely to sell. If you put the items at eye level, they're much less likely to sell. And what we've seen is the adoption of smart technologies to capture this information in order to target that, or at least an attempt to do it. And the Privacy Commissioner a few years ago issued some concerning remarks around the use of this technology. But actually, thinking about this personally, and for anyone with children, there is an exception to that rule, and I want you to think about how this makes you feel. So as I say, the items in the middle of the row are the ones they're going to be targeting with the highest value. The exception is brightly coloured, sugary items, where they'll put them lower down. And that's because they know they're going to be targeting that at your children. And they know that stressed parents are less likely to be able to say no to their child when they're in the shop asking for that money. Now, coming back, well, why does that matter? Because this is all personal information that's being monetized and used for a purpose that people at the end of the session are really raising issues with. One other area we're seeing this growth in personal information is around smart cities. We're seeing personal information at a larger scale really being used to direct resources and to be a bit smarter about certainly traffic management and road charges and congestion. This again has raised issues around personal information and really those boundaries. But what we see, certainly within smart cities, is terabytes of data being consumed, and some real challenges around the scope of what people are comfortable with that. I don't want to go too far into smart cities because we could talk about it for a full hour, but all I really need to touch on today is actually that this fits squarely within that definition of what we consider personal information. Coming back to the at work, the real move we've seen lately is that there's this growth of personal information around what's being captured in workplaces. To use, sorry, that's going to fail. I mean, now we have logs where this card, which I cannot hold up now because it's being removed by the background, tracks me around the building. I know, my building in my company knows when I enter and when I exit, and this information can be used in very useful ways for companies. Certainly within employment investigations, this is actually a real minefield of where that personal information can be quite useful for companies when there's concerns about hours of work and performance in the workplace. There's all this new data being collected that traditionally wasn't there. But there's a real challenge here around these matters of, well, is that personal information that really actually is about a person, or is that about their workplace performance? And the difficulty with that is we're seeing that there's real grey areas in that. There's certainly a whole lot of new technologies that are allowing people to capture that information though. And we're seeing that there is a definite suggestion that a lot of this is personal information and it should be considered within that scope. A few I just want to call out quite specifically there's building sensors. Now, these are being used to track where people are in buildings, certainly for evacuation purposes, for targeting of services, certainly if they need IT support, so that you know where people are within flexible working arrangements. And this, in the COVID-19 era, is going to become more and more meaningful as we're needing to track people and their contact with workplaces, possessions, and other people. And the real takeaway, I guess, here is that it's no longer weird or unusual that there will be a privacy impact assessment on a workplace. Now, that isn't something that a few years ago that was normal or key, but it is definitely the way of the future. And as these buildings are getting faster and smarter, it makes sense, and it just has to be done, that we're thinking about the privacy implications of the personal information that buildings and workplaces are capturing. The other place that we're really adopting a lot of this smart technology that's capturing personal information, and I've actually just got on board with this myself, is at home. We're seeing a lot of smart technologies being used and embedded within homes to track personal information. I'm only going to touch on this really briefly, and I know it has been a bit of a controversial matter in New Zealand that due to time we can't touch on too far, is the home sensors. Now, there's been a lot of discussion around, are home sensors personal information? These are ones that can detect dampness, mold, occupancy, warmth. Now, I guess to be a bit controversial, and I know I might be taking a view that some other people didn't agree with, I don't see how it's not. Because this is information we can link back to people, and it really actually does affect them. Imagine you're a landlord, or I'm a landlord. I'm imagining I want to know, are my tenants looking after the property? I want to know, are they opening the windows? Is it damp? Is it well heated? So that I know the value of my property. That's all stuff that I am going to tangibly act on and affect the tenant, or impact the tenant if it is showing bad results. We're also welcoming these in to our own homes within our smart devices and our entertainment devices. This is collecting a whole lot of personal information, certainly around voice and these schedules of how we interact with our building. I say I've recently joined in. My colleagues are going to laugh at me raising this, but I've recently jumped on the bandwagon of having smart lights within my own home. Now, within a week of installing these lights, I've got my schedule into it. I have my own automation for when I get home and when I leave home. Now, this reveals a whole lot about me. When I'm in, when I'm not in, how I'm using the building and how I'm not. And all I'm getting at here is we're now getting into an environment, into a world where a whole lot of personal information is constantly being captured about us. And we need to think about the privacy obligations of that. The only one I note here, in the interest of time just going past it, is we're getting to the world where we've got smart fridges that are able to remind us that we might need to buy something. And we think about the commercialization of that and targeted marketing and where we're heading around this constantly tracked, monitored world of ours. And what we get from this is that we might not be asked a lot of information, but there's a lot of it that's been inferred about us. Now, my smart home or my smart devices might not have asked me what time I get home each day, but from my usage, you can infer that. A lot of businesses, and you might be struggling with this as you're hearing this, actually have a whole lot of personal information that you don't ask about your consumers. You just kind of hold and you work out. And this is actually a matter the Privacy Act is really good about. It tells us the answer. That is, if you have this personal information that you haven't asked your consumer for, and you haven't brought about them telling it to you, it's still personal information, but the collection principles don't apply. And what that means is principles 1 to 4 don't result in any issue for you. But if you're kind of hinting, if you're suggesting, if you're leaving the box available, suggesting that your customer should provide you this information, then you're really getting yourself into an area where you might be collecting information. Even if you're not collecting it, you still have to think about the risk of holding that information, because principles 5 to 12, soon to be 5 to 13, still do apply. The particular one is principle 5. If you are holding this information, you really need to think about the cost of storing it and looking after it, even if you haven't got a business purpose for having it. So really the easiest thing to do is to not hold it. And that means actually making it quite difficult for your clients and your customers to tell you this information that you've got no purpose holding. This brings us on to the topic of the moment, contact tracing. This raises all of the issues that we've previously touched on around that smart technology. It brings us on to this idea of this personal information that's currently blooming into this new idea of contact tracing. Who we engage with and how we engage with people and businesses is definitely personal information about us, and it is tremendously valuable. What we've also seen in the past is that for a lot of companies and a lot of businesses, and actually a lot of government agencies, have really got caught out in this idea of saying this isn't personal information because we can anonymize it and we can store it on in a way that never is going to be used unless we need to use it. And the famous example, and I can send it, and indeed I can put it into the chat in just a moment, is the New York taxi data. And this was believed that it was going to be anonymized data that was released around taxis traveling around New York. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head precisely how long it took, but it was, I think, less than 2 days before this data was unanonymized and actually revealed some really real implications about people. Someone quite quickly visualized it, and it showed taxis traveling around New York. So what? Well, it didn't take long before someone pointed out that the so what was that within that, there were people having affairs, there were people having medical emergencies. It revealed the moment where, for instance, a taxi arrived at someone's home after they had just left and arrived just before they returned, and it created some real issues. Contact tracing gets us into this domain of really businesses having to think about what does this data reveal at a broader level? What does it reveal for advertisers? What does it reveal about people's behaviours and their transactions? There's some really good guidance that are being released at the moment. One is by the Privacy Commission, and I see Mark has just put it up for anyone that's interested in that. We're also seeing a lot of places releasing guidance, and that will support you as you engage in this new era of contact tracing. But I do want to really stress this idea of that this data, this information really does reveal a lot more than we necessarily think about. And I have an example here of a smart device, a fitness device, that has the ability to track. And some people will have seen a couple of years ago that the fitness company Strava released heat maps about where these devices were tracking people. So what, you might ask? Well, what is revealed on screen in this picture is the fitness data, the frequency of people running around a venue. It just so happens that this venue is the Helmand army base in Afghanistan. When we zoom out this map a bit more, we can see the map again of where these fitness trackers are being used in Helmand, Afghanistan. This map is a map of where the foreign soldiers are deployed, and it showed locations that people didn't necessarily know about. And this raises this growing trend around privacy, and this topic we can't cover or satisfiably cover today, around the fact that personal information is beginning to raise these real difficulties around personal privacy rights and group privacy. The real difficulty that really is actually unanswered at a high level is this use of group data and your privacy protections and your use of customers' data and your personal settings really affecting those around you. And we saw within Cambridge Analytica and the American election and other elections overseas, the misuse of private information being used at a global scale and a domestic scale to influence elections. This is getting into this whole new domain around how do we really conceptualize protecting personal information to protect us all. And this idea that actually protecting all of us requires protecting each of us individually. And we've seen certainly within Brexit, the first indications of actually quite substantial fines over the misuse of personal information. Their midwifery databases and stuff like that were being misused for the purpose of targeting marketing towards Brexit. I'm running out of time quite quickly, but I think I've touched most on where this is heading. It's heading towards this domain of actually the grey becoming a lot less, a lot more relevant to the day-to-day operations of businesses. We're touching on this world where our digital footprint is really becoming increasingly relevant to who we are and affecting us and our customers in increasingly tangible ways. We're seeing examples where real life processing of personal information is causing tangible harm. Overseas, we saw examples where adverts and smart adverts have been placed on billboards that interact with people walking down the street. Now, how would you feel if your internet history was used to target ads to you as you walked down the street? It turned out people weren't very happy with it. In New Zealand, we saw examples where advertisers were using people's personal names in adverts within videos, and people raised concerns. We're also seeing real risks around the use of data leading to theft and deception. We're seeing raises around some of the certainly big bulk data sets leading to tangible harm to people because of identity theft. And how is your business and company going to protect people if this happens? This harm is going to lead to this duty that you have to protect people from harm. I mean, just to take a step back, imagine you release the address of an individual, and that individual turns out to be someone that is escaping domestic violence. You could be responsible for the loss resulting from them having to move house. You might be required to pay for a home security system. That could easily, and has recently worked out to be just pure loss of about $30,000. Skipping through again, the key thing is we're here to help. Hopefully today's session has brought you along so there's some clear pictures around how you can help your business and you've got a concrete understanding. We actually have some resources available. I mean, I'm not here to sell you anything, but even just for free, there's services available on on our website around that security and privacy engineering into your business. We've also got an infographic around what your digital footprint says about you. We also have the training courses where you can think about these issues and more around, in particular, the CIPP session and how do you set up your business. The key thing to come back to is it's all about trust. Coming back to that exercise at the beginning, that trust that you place that I would not read that piece of paper is key, and that connection is key that people feel to this information.